Fantasy Island. The film starts on an island with a woman named Sloane Madison running from some. She calls the island's owner, Mr. Rourke, for help, but he reminds her she is a guest there, and Sloane is captured by her pursuer. Later on, a plane full of guests arrive at Fantasy Island, where Rourke greets them along with his assistant Julia. Among them are Gwen Olsen, Melanie Cole, Patrick Sullivan, and stepbrothers JD and Brax Weaver. Rourke tells them that all of their greatest fantasies can be fulfilled until they reach their natural conclusion. Watching the guests from afar is a man called Damon. After the guests get to know each other, Rourke begins to take them to their fantasies. He brings JD and Brax to a fantasy of an Endel's party, where JD hangs out with a crowd of beautiful women while Brax hangs out with handsome men and a bunch of weed. While partying, Brax sees what looks like an apparition of a horribly burnt man. The next morning, Gwen meets Rourke, who asks her questions specific to her background. She is shown to her fantasy, a restaurant where she rejected a proposal from her ex-boyfriend in order to pursue her career goals. She is met by the ex-boyfriend, Alan. He is real and has been roped into the fantasy, which Gwen feels bad for. However, she enjoys reconnecting with Alan, and when he proposes once again, she chooses to accept. Melanie talks to Patrick about her personal fantasy, which is to torment her former school bully. Rourke then brings her to a basement where she finds Sloane tied up behind a two-way mirror. Thinking it's just a hologram, Melanie proceeds to torture her by zapping her or dumping toilet water on her. She then uploads a video of Sloane having an affair with another man, which is posted on Facebook for her husband to see. The computer then calls her husband, and Melanie quickly realizes that Sloane is really there, and she tries to stop her from getting hurt more. A man dressed as a surgeon enters, and he resembles a doctor that used to terrify Melanie, whom she nicknamed Dr. Torture. He gets ready to use a buzzsaw on Sloane's arm until Melanie turns on the cattle prod and toilet water to electrocute Dr. Torture and free Sloane. Melanie pretends to be a guest to not let Sloane know she was torturing her. Patrick is taken to his fantasy, which is putting him back in a war setting in the 80s where he reunites with his father, who was killed in action. Patrick is taken by the other soldiers as a prisoner. As this happens, JD and Brax are screwing around with what is in their mansion, including an array of grenades and guns. The soldiers overhear this and end up in a firefight with enemies in their zone. JD and Brax then learn that the mansion is owned by a thug named Kuleshov, and a group of his armed thugs are approaching. Melanie and Sloane go through the dark woods to find a way off the island, but Dr. Torture finds them again and attacks. They are saved by Damon, who impales the surgeon with his machete. Damon tells the ladies he was a private investigator who showed up as a guest whose fantasy was to see his dead daughter again, and it came true, but things turned into a nightmare and he became trapped there. Damon also reveals that Rourke spiked the guests' drinks with some kind of magic water that is the source of granting the guests their fantasies. They resolve to get to a phone to call for help, while also getting some of the water in a canteen. However, when looking into the fountain, the guests' fantasies are shown. Sloane's is to get back with her husband, while Melanie's is shown to torture Sloane, letting her realize that Melanie lied about being a guest, and gives Melanie a chance to vent her anger to Sloane over her treatment of her. Mr. Sullivan confronts Patrick after finding a picture of himself with his own son in Patrick's belongings. He reveals that that is him as a child, and Mr. Sullivan is his father. Although he proves information only both of them could know, Mr. Sullivan is not convinced that Patrick will do anything to prevent him from his fate, which will happen during a hostage rescue mission in Venezuela that will happen the next day. Gwen wakes up to find that she has already married Alan and that they have a 5-year-old daughter named Lila. Gwen tries to find Rourke and change her fantasy, because this is not what she had in mind. She talks to Julia and tells her that her fantasy was to go back and save someone from a fire she caused. He tells Gwen that his own fantasy was to be able to see his dead wife, and it can only continue as long as he fulfills the guests' fantasies. Although Rourke initially refuses, Gwen convinces him to let her enter the new fantasy after pointing out that he can only see his wife if he lets her have her fantasy. Kuleshov's head thug interrogates JD and Brax over some money that is supposedly in the mansion. They try to trick the thugs by saying that the money is in the garage, where their weapons are. At the same time, Gwen enters her new fantasy to the burning building. She sees JD and Brax running away. She tries to make her way into the burning apartment to save the victim, Nick Taylor. She runs outside to get help, finding Patrick there as a cop who doesn't help since he wants to wait for the firefighters. Gwen runs back inside but goes unconscious until she is found by Julia. Patrick and the soldiers arrive to the site of the hostage situation, which happens to be the mansion. After JD and Brax manage to fight off some of the thugs, Patrick finds them and helps kill some of the thugs, but they come back to life as zombies. JD and Mr. Sullivan end up killed, with neither Brax nor Patrick able to help them. Melanie, Sloane, and Damon are attacked by a zombie Dr. Torture, who once again attempts to attack Sloane until Damon sacrifices himself by throwing himself and the surgeon over the edge of a cliff. The ladies then return to the torture room to reach a phone. Sloane calls her husband and apologizes to him over her deception, while also using it as an apology toward Melanie. They then contact Damon's associates for help to escape. As everything is starting to get worse, the guests gather to confront Rourke and his henchmen over the fantasy, as they are all in the fantasy of someone who wants them dead, and Gwen concludes they are all connected to Nick. She caused the fire that killed him by accidentally leaving the kettle on in her apartment, and Patrick was at the scene but didn't go in to help. JD was Nick's roommate and was going to check on him, but Brax made him leave. Melanie was supposed to go on a date with Nick that night but got sick and backed out, meaning Nick wouldn't have died if she was with him. They then run to catch the plane, but it is shot down by the thugs. The guests run to hide and believe that Julia was Nick's mother who wants revenge on them. They resolve to destroy Rourke's fountain to stop the fantasy altogether. The group enters the cave to find the fountain, where they are attacked by manifestations of their personal demons. Sloane sees her bullying self, while Patrick is attacked by dead people he couldn't save, and Gwen sees that Lila has killed Alan. Nick's ghost also appears before her but doesn't know who Julia is when Gwen mentions her. After they fight everyone off, Melanie appears before Patrick and starts stabbing him. The others reach the fountain to destroy it with a grenade, but Rourke stops them, because Julia was his wife and he doesn't want to stop seeing her after she passed away. It is then revealed that they are all in Melanie's fantasy. She wanted to go out with Nick that night, but she stood him up due to her self-doubt from Sloane's bullying. Rourke sees that Julia is close to succumbing to her illness again, and she convinces him that it is time to let her go once and for all. He does so and goes to help the others. He tells Sloane that she still has to fulfill a fantasy. She drinks from the canteen and wishes for Melanie and Nick to end up together. Nick's zombie then emerges from the fountain and pulls Melanie inside, causing the zombies to disappear. She jumps out quickly to throw back the grenade, but Patrick throws himself onto it to save everyone. Gwen, Sloane, and Brax wake up the next day as they are preparing to leave. Rourke tells Brax that he technically lived out JD's fantasy, so he still has one he can use. His fantasy is for JD to return home alive, which would mean he would have to stay on the island. Brax agrees, and JD goes home on the plane with Gwen and Sloane. Brax then reveals JD's nickname for him, Tattoo. He stays and becomes Rourke's new assistant.